Hello, and here we are once again, introducing you to a familiar hymn. I chose Amazing Grace. I devoted a lot of thought to this. It's a very familiar hymn, and frankly, I have always known about it. Strangely enough, I have found that not everybody does know about it, not even in my classes. Although it really is very popular among Americans. For example, very few of them, I usually mention this in class, we talk about phrasing, we talk about aspects of the melody, and I usually give them a very tiny bit of history. And it's been a complete surprise to me that many people don't have any idea what the background of this very familiar hymn is. It may come as a shock, actually, when we get into it. Some of you may already know the story. Let me just play the melody again. I'm going to do it on the black keys. Why am I doing that? Well, because there are really only 5 notes in it. It's called pentatonic when it is only 5 notes. That makes it very easy to play. As a matter of fact, I've had piano students that I just asked them to see if they can play it on the black keys. Very familiar tune, okay? I'm not playing it with harmony. That is, I'm not putting any other notes to go along with just the melody. The melody actually is pentatonic. The harmony actually is not. It has actually 7 notes in it. Now, if you happen to be looking at your hymnal, you might find this is number 649. And if you look down at the bottom of the page, you will find actually all kinds of information about the hymn. It usually goes by the name of Amazing Grace, for example. It's down in the lower right-hand corner. It says CM, actually it's a common meter, but in any case, this says that stanzas 1 through 4 are by John Newton. We're going to talk about him in just a second. 1772. Stanza 5 is from somewhere else, 1790. We'll talk about that in a little bit in just a second too. The music is from Columbian Harmony, 1829, and so on and so forth. All of this is kind of just very interesting stuff for musicians like me because I look at all this sort of thing. And there's usually a little bit of a note right above that explains something about the text, maybe what the poet had in mind, when it was composed, and so on and so forth. You can actually read that if you happen to have a hymnal handy. I think it's very interesting that this is so familiar that it actually has a Choctaw language text, a Creek language text, a Navajo language text, a Cherokee language text on the next page, and a Kiowa language text. So it really has made its rounds and is very familiar to Native Americans. Let's talk a little bit about this particular hymn. It's extremely interesting. It has a lot of aspects to it that are very timely nowadays. You will notice that it is actually more controversial than you might ever have imagined. The words are by a man by the name of John Newton. We'll have a picture of him in a second. He was born in 1725, died in 1807 at age 82. Author of many hymns, some very famous ones, including, for example, Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken, which, by the way, has been put to a very familiar tune. Actually a tune that is by Joseph Haydn. I won't get off on that. I easily get off in class on tangents, but I won't get off on that particular tune. But that text, Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken, is by John Newton. He also wrote many other hymns, but another one that comes to mind is How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds. And Amazing Grace, of course, is this very familiar one. If you look at the bottom of your page, 649, you may actually see this was really originally called, it was written in 1772, it was originally called Faith, Review, and Expectation. kind of a pompous name for a tune that everybody knows by the first two words, Amazing Grace. The title is taken from the first two words, of course. The title, as I said, was originally Faith, Review, and Expectation. It was written for New Year's Day service in 1773. This is before the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, right? It is on the biblical text, and this is also at the bottom of your page, is 649 if you're looking at a hymnal, 1 Chronicles 17, verses 16 through 17. But it also references a number of theological points, and in various places, these are given as sources for the text. John Newton was a clergyman, as a matter of fact, and so he knew, of course, these references. It references Romans 5:15, Psalm 66, verse 16, and John 9:25, and even Ephesians 2, verses 4 through 9, in which Paul writes, "It is by grace you have been saved." Along with other such texts, Newton's poems, that is his text for these things, which were intended to be sung, they were published in a volume in 1779 called the Olney Hymns. He was a clergyman who was serving in a small parish, a small town in Buckinghamshire in England by the name of Olney. He put together these various poems, and there are hundreds of them, by the way, in 3 volumes called the Olney Hymns. They were put together by Newton himself and William Cowper, a poet of the late 18th century, who, by the way, wrote a hymn that I don't think anybody has ever asked for at St. Philip's, although I have played it in other churches. Once in a while you find an old-timer who knows this hymn, which is by William Cowper. There is a fountain filled with blood. Nobody's ever asked for that here, and I wonder if if everybody has gotten too old to remember it. I don't know. Anyway, Newton wrote about 280 of these hymns. There are about 348. So Cowper himself wrote about 68 of the others. They were intended to be sung, but no music was actually published in the books. Amazing Grace seems to have been associated with about 20 different tunes in the course of its lifetime, to the present day, I guess, until finally settling on a tune that we know as New Britain. I don't believe that is actually listed at the bottom of page 649, but New Britain is the tune that I just played. That was put together over 50 years after Newton died. It was put together by an American, William Walker, and we have a picture of him, an American who put this into the Southern Harmony, a kind of a hymnal, you might say, that was making the rounds in early America. During the time of the Second Awakening, when there were lots of revivals going on in America, there were lots of these hymnals that were being published during that time. The Southern Harmony has some wonderful tunes in it, and in fact many of those tunes are sung to this day. This particular one seems to have been published maybe first about 1829, that's the tune, and was not joined to the text, though, until about 1835, and it appears in the Southern Harmony in 1847. We use many of these hymns from the Southern Harmony nowadays. Well, I won't get off on a tangent with some of these wonderful tunes, but a friend of mine said many years ago, if you ever find a Southern Harmony actually on sale anywhere, since I'm a bookaholic anyway, by all means let me know. Well, I've kind of lost touch, but unfortunately I was looking this up online, and yes, you can get Southern Harmony today, and it has some really wonderful tunes in it. The hymn first appeared with the title Amazing Grace, however, in 1877 in a work called Sacred Songs and Solos. The first 6 verses, by the way, if you're looking at 649, you only see 5 of them. The first 6 verses are by Newton. They seem to be based on his personal experience. We will talk a little bit about that in a second. There is a 7th verse, however, which appears in 649 as verse number 5. So there are 2 verses that are missing. That 5th verse is actually not by him and appears to have been from another hymn called Jerusalem, My Happy Home in about 1790. And you might find that 1790 is mentioned way down at the bottom of the page in a collection of sacred ballads. More on that in just a second, too. That's actually my favorite verse, but it turns out it's not even by Newton in any case. The two verses that are forgotten are 5 and 6, the original 5 and 6. These two verses and the 7th verse, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and they were put into the mouth and the voice of Uncle Tom, who was singing these last 3 verses in the course of that novel. Another verse is sometimes included is perhaps by Isaac Watts, a little earlier poet, which was recorded by Pete Seeger and Arlo Guthrie at Woodstock, I believe. Shall I be wafted through the skies on flowery beds of ease, where others strive to win the prize and sail through bloody seas? Well, I've never heard that verse, but at any rate, that is typical of many of these hymns, that people will add verses over the course of time and forget other verses, and so on and so forth. I ran across one of them, as a matter of fact, the one I just mentioned, the New Jerusalem, My Happy Home. I believe over the course of time it had something like 70 verses, if you can imagine. Anyway, a little bit more about this piece. It became very popular in America, not so much in England, largely through the Second Awakening, a revivalist culture in the 1820s, when people would go, especially in the South, but through the North as well, to revival, tent revival meetings, and so on. By the 1860s, it had appeared in several Protestant hymnals, beginning with Dutch Reformed, Baptists, and other denominations, and was in hymnals issued to the Union troops in the Civil War. It wasn't recorded until 1922. Many versions were done in the 70s in particular, including Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Elvis, even President Obama sang part of it in a memorial service for the Reverend. The Reverend had apparently been killed in an explosion, a terrorist bombing. Oh, well, this gets into an area of our hymn that is going to become more and more interesting as we get along. The meter is what we call 8686. If you have your hymnal handy, you can look this up at the back of the hymnal. There are a bunch of hymns along about page 1005 or so. You'll see a lot of numbers, and that really just means that that's the number of syllables in a line. And if you find something that is 8686, well, then you can sing that tune to a whole list of other tunes that are listed beneath that. That's kind of how pastors very often do. As a matter of fact, they look up a hymn, and maybe people don't know that particular hymn, and so they look for one that is a more familiar tune, and so they can compare tunes that way. Anyway, some highlights about Newton's life. I've got a little bit more actually about Newton than I have actually about the composer of the actual tune. Again, he was born in 1725 in Wapping. That's a district of London. His father was a merchant ship captain. His mother passed away when he was 6, and so he was kind of an abandoned child in a way, because his father was usually gone for several years at a time. So he was cared for by during the absences of his father by the Catlett family, whose daughter Mary he eventually wed, the true love of his life apparently. Anyway, he was raised in a split religious environment. His mother was a nonconformist. Now, I'm not sure, since she died when he was 6, I'm not sure if that really means his stepmother perhaps was nonconformist. That is, she didn't go along with some of the things that were in the Anglican faith at the time, but his father was educated by Jesuits in Spain. Again, of course, he was a sailor, so he wasn't there very often. Therefore, Newton, the poet, a bit of a nonconformist himself and really kind of resisted authority. When he was about 18, he was impressed into the Royal Navy. Now, impressment is an issue in American history as well. The Royal Navy at that time was in the habit of keeping their recruits up by simply grabbing people. And so they would perhaps even give them a a drug or something, a drink or whatever, and then they would wake up on board a Navy ship. Lots of interesting stories about this kind of thing. In any case, he wound up in the Royal Navy. He rebelled. He tried to run away. He's just a youngster after all, 18. He was demoted. He was flogged. Eventually, the Royal Navy tried to get rid of him, and they traded him to another ship. He was very irreligious. He enjoyed chipping away at other people's beliefs. And we know this because he said this himself, actually, in his many, many writings, that he was very much into profane language. He described himself as a libertine. He was into all kinds of mischievous behavior and just absolutely, totally run wild. But one of the things that actually was true in his life was that he was impressed by his extreme luck in somehow or other being saved miraculously from death. Many instances apparently really impressed themselves on him. Eventually he was traded for another man on a merchant slave ship. Well, this slave ship was on its way, as a matter of fact, to Sierra Leone in Africa. Hope I pronounced that right. He caught malaria and he was traded off by the slave ship's captain to his mistress, who was a native, a Princess Paye. And you can look her up actually online. I was really surprised to hear this little part of the story. Quite an interesting part. Well, as a matter of fact, she was, of course, a native African. She had her own slaves, and she treated him like one, too. Eventually, he was rescued. Thus, when we look at the words, we see not only that it is actually based on Scripture and based on what he would be preaching about, but it actually has various references that may have had something to do even with his own life. His libertine stretch, for example, when he uses the word, "How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." In other words, he's really talking about himself at a time when he really did not believe the Christian faith. He was completely devoid of that, as a matter of fact. He makes reference to this on his tombstone, as a matter of fact. He wrote his own epitaph, and he refers to himself as a slave of slaves. That is, he himself was in slavery in Africa to an African princess. Apparently, he was inspired during this period of his life by reading an abridgment of Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ, and he eventually came to Christ. But he did not come to Christ as a result of anything involving slavery. He was on a storm. He was on a ship during a storm, and his cry for help was, in the words of the text, "The hour I first believed." This would have been in the late 1740s. He would have been about 25 plus, a little less than 25 perhaps, if he was born in 1725. He found his way back to England. He paid court to Mary, and then he returned to the sea as a slaver to make money for his new bride. Now, he has actually been sort of technically converted to Christianity. He wed her in 1750, and he returned to slaving. His Christian ideas begun to insinuate themselves into his observations. And so, although he was actually operating, and was for a point a captain of a slave ship, he was kind of imbued with humanitarian ideals, which he impressed on his shipmates, that they should treat people with dignity and with humanitarian concerns, and not just to be brutal to them. Now, he hasn't made the association of slavery itself as being inherently, necessarily an evil, but that will come later. So in 1754, when he was only, 29 perhaps? Still a young man, actually. He had experienced something like a stroke and had to give up seafaring. But he began studying Christianity in depth from this point on. He didn't have a college degree or anything of that sort, but he had experienced the call. And so he went out of his way, in fact, to get educated in Christianity. In 1764, 10 years later, he finally was ordained in the Anglican Church. He was assigned to Olney, where he wrote his poems. These poems, again, were published in 1779. There is a copy of them, as a matter of fact, I found an original edition in the University of Texas in Austin. Also, he met William Cowper, who came to settle in Olney, and together they published these poems. He was also a new Christian. He became interested in the rising anti-slavery feeling of the time and became associated with William Wilberforce. I have a little picture of him, a member of Parliament and a great and passionate voice against the slave trade at that time. And he came out with a pamphlet against the slave trade, that is, Newton did, called Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade. He adopted this as his new position. For a long time, as a Christian and indeed as a clergyman, he was continuing to invest in the African slave trade. But it was not until still later that he gradually came to believe that, well, this was an unchristian thing to be doing. Many Christians still believed that slavery was justified by the Bible. And therefore, he and Wilberforce, they avoided building their protests on a religious platform, but instead were condemning the practice as inhumane treatment of their fellow human beings. And of course, Newton is speaking from his own experiences because he was a captain of a slave ship for indeed several years. Cowper joined in the abolitionist poems. This was in the 1780s. In 1789, the bill for the abolition of slavery went to Parliament. It took a long time to pass, but it eventually passed largely through Newton's encouragement of Wilberforce, insisting that this was something that really people needed to do. So they eventually passed in both houses in 1807 the proscription, the abolition of slavery and traffic in slavery, and George III, yes, of American Revolutionary fame, signed it into law. This, I think, is very interesting. I didn't really do a little research on this, but I believe it was maybe the next year that in America, the traffic in slavery was prohibited. There were illegal activities, of course, but in any case, it was actually, they were no longer able to import slaves, but slavery continued to exist, obviously, until the Civil War. Now, I did find this actually about this hymn. There's no direct link between Amazing Grace and the abolition of slavery in Britain. So you have to read it between the lines, knowing who the poet was and what he's actually referring to. He's referring to his life as a slaver. And not only as a slaver, but as a person who really didn't have a clue as to what the Christian life was really all about. This was something he had to kind of grow into. In an essay, he said himself, "I hope it will always be a subject of humiliating reflection to me that I was once an active instrument in a business at which my heart now shudders." Thus, it seems fitting that this hymn has become virtually an anthem for civil rights and for any kind of social injustice. On his epitaph, he wrote, "John Newton, clerk, once an infidel and libertine, a servant of slaves in Africa, was, by the rich mercy of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, restored, pardoned, and appointed to preach the gospel which he had long labored to destroy. He administered nearly 16 years in Olney in Buckinghamshire and 28 years in this particular church." I think that he was initially buried in London, but eventually he was transferred. He and his wife were both transferred to Olney, which is now kind of called Amazing Grace Town. The verses actually, I'm just going to say a brief bit about this. The verses that are usually not done, there's no reason why they wouldn't be done, but we're all familiar, of course, with the first four, as they are in the hymnal. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, it was grace that taught my heart to fear, through many dangers, toils, and snares, the Lord has promised good to me, and so on. Just giving you the first line of each of those stanzas. But the two that are missing are, "Yea, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace." Now we're talking about life beyond, right? The next one, the earth shall soon dissolve like snow. The sun forbear to shine, but God who called me here below shall be forever mine. Now, the last verse that is included in our hymnal is verse 5, which is actually verse 7. That is not by him at all, and was, as I said, a different hymn, Jerusalem, My Happy Home, and it was inserted into Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's my favorite verse, alas. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. Very interesting vision of life everlasting, to which I might add that others have added other verses. Judy Collins recorded this song back in the 70s, and she added, my chains are gone, I've been set free, my God, my Savior has ransomed me, and like a flood his mercy reigns, unending love, amazing grace. It has been studied a great deal indeed. There's so much stuff online I couldn't really get through it all. Bill Moyers did a documentary on the tune in 1990. I haven't seen it, but I have read that he concluded that the tune was actually a slave tune. I'm kind of doubtful of that, but I won't get into the technicalities of that. But that has been studied a great deal too. A movie was made in 2006 called Amazing Grace about his conversion, and another film, Freedom, 2014. These are actually all available online. Perhaps not free, I don't know. But in any case, there is a lot of material about it. The hymn has become so popular, in fact, that one of the things it says on Wikipedia is that it is almost in danger of becoming a cliche. It's very often done with bagpipes, no words at all, and it's a very moving tune. The tune itself, I want to say that it has a kind of a political life as well. It now is being done in every imaginable kind of venue, not necessarily with the poet's original intent. That is, if you really look at the words, he is talking about the experience of Christ, and Christ actually redeeming him when he was absolutely at the bottom of his spiritual development. I just want to play the whole thing once again, just by itself, with the harmony and so on. I'm doing it on the black keys, but I'm playing some of the white keys in the harmony. So, enjoy Amazing Grace.